Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for Orchestrating a Better Future with new Audition and Tenure Guidelines from NAAS. I am Leanne Norman, Director of Learning and Leadership Programs here at the League of American Orchestras. The National Alliance for Audition Support, NAAS, is an unprecedented national initiative to increase diversity in American orchestras. It does so by offering Black and Latinx musicians a customized combination of mentoring, audition preparation, financial support, and audition previews. NAAS is made up of the Sphinx Organization, the lead program administrator and fiscal agent for the Alliance, the new World Symphony, and the League of American Orchestras. In addition, a group of Black and Latinx professional musicians act as thought leaders, guides, and advisors for the Alliance. Today's webinar is made possible by generous support from American Express, the Baisley Powell Albash Fund, Ford Motor Company Fund, the Howard Gilman Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts, with additional support of public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. Before we begin, a few notes of housekeeping. I want to draw your attention to ways you can interact with colleagues and speakers who are in attendance today. On the right side of your screen, you will see tabs for the chat and Q&A functions. Use the chat function to say hello to others or to make general comments throughout the session. Please use the Q&A function to ask speakers questions. Questions typed in the Q&A function will only be seen by the speakers. Today's webinar is closed captioned. To access captioning, please click the link listed in the session description at the bottom of the screen. At the end of today's session, please take a moment to complete the brief feedback survey. The link for it can also be found at the bottom of the screen in the session description. After the webinar, all registered attendees will receive a recording and transcript of today's conversation and any additional materials such as the presentation deck. Once again, thank you for attending Orchestrating a Better Future with new Audition and Tenure Guidelines from NAAS. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dwerkin, who's President and Artistic Director of the Sphinx Organization. And I'd like to share a few highlights from her bio. Named as one of Musical America's top 30 influencers in the nation, a recipient of the Kennedy Center's Human Spirit Award, and one of Detroit Crane's 40 Under 40, Afa is a cross-sector leader whose strengths are informed by her international experience in the corporate world, her musical training, and more than 25 years of experience in the cultural sphere. Ms. Dwerkin has delivered ongoing thought leadership through an extensive roster of high-profile speaking engagements, and she's former faculty at Clarkston Conservatory in Michigan and serves as a lecturer at the University of Michigan's School of Music, Theater, and Dance. She is also adjunct faculty at Roosevelt University's Arts Administration Master's Program. In addition, she builds capacity for the Midwestern arts community through her service as a trustee for the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, Global Music Society, and Culture Source. Thank you again, Afa, for facilitating our conversation today. Now I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Leanne. Thank you, everybody, and welcome to Orchestrating a Better Future. It is wonderful to see everyone's names in chat. Today, our time together is going to be spent talking about the National Alliance for Audition Support, the ethos behind organizing the effort, and I think more importantly, the methodology behind some best practices and proposed revised and evolved ways in which we can work together toward a more vibrant, more representative future in our American orchestras. Just as Leanne mentioned, National Alliance for Audition Support is a conglomerate of programs in and of itself, and also a collection of organizations who have come together to really get this effort off the ground about 3.5 years ago with the seed support from the Mellon Foundation. So to talk a little more about our work thus far. Right. Besides the importance of developing these guidelines and important best practices, I thought I would share some of the success stories because I think we can all use a bit of good news on a day like today. I think most recently, I want to say that one of the ways in which NAAS has been able to develop is that we held the first ever national Excerpt competition that welcomed more than 100 auditionees, which were competitively selected online, virtually. And we had 75 partner orchestras who participated in the auditions, of which we had 15 jurors who actually adjudicated each audition and made the selections. And from that, we also had about 540 listeners representing our partner orchestras who joined those several days of auditions to also participate and audit the competition and get to know these incredibly well-prepared, poised, emerging artists who are seeking a pathway into careers on American orchestral stages. So what's really important about this most recent effort is that we expect that there will be 75 weeks of paid work that will be offered and orchestrated, no pun intended, by our orchestral partners and coordinated by Sphinx for these candidates who were able to participate in the competition. We awarded about 17,000 in prizes, and there were about 19 prizes in total awarded in all instrument categories and divisions. So for us, it's important because what we're trying to do is go beyond the support mechanisms which we've established for our artists and go beyond the coachings and mentorship, which these artists have been taken advantage of. Of course, money is important, but at a time like ours, when there's not a ton of auditions, we're trying to look for other ways and new methodologies that we can all pilot together and implement so that when we're ready to return a stage together, we can actually look back and say we've really looked at different methodologies which really has resulted into change and really helped us look at a better and more representative stage and really created paid work opportunity for our artists. Overall, NAAS, in terms of its work over the past 2.5 to 3 years, we have had 45 cumulative placements within American orchestras for the participating roster of the musicians. There are currently 103 partnering orchestras for NAAS, which I think is really significant and fundamentally important because from the inception of this program, we knew that we cannot do this work alone. It would only be successful, it would only generate impact if we do the work together in partnership with orchestras. And by partnership, I don't mean just folks who are signing checks, but folks who are also sitting down behind stage with us and figuring out how is it that we implement change and how do we go beyond, so to speak, these focus groups and op-ed committees and different conglomerate of people who are generally like-minded and would like to see change but aren't able to push change forward. So in that way, I think NAAS is particularly unprecedented in that it's gathered people of different walks of life and different facets from within our industry who have been able to sit down and talk about our differences and push progress forward. So we're really proud to acknowledge those 103 orchestras who have joined us in this effort. And it really started small. We were at about 10 orchestras in the first year, and then we saw this precipitous growth, which is really fantastic. We've been able to award almost 400 awards, totaling nearly 350,000 since the inception of this program. And there are a total of almost 260 alumni of this effort overall. So this is a group of artists who we're working with. And I'm mentioning these numbers not simply to kind of provide a scorecard, but to mention that there are at least that many musicians who are actively interested and actively pursuing a career toward a life in an American orchestra. So it's something for us to feel encouraged about, I think, because it signals to us that orchestras are relevant, they are timely and important, and that there is not only interest amongst the musicians of color, but there's also readiness and a process which is preparing these musicians for these placements. So I think all of those elements together comprise good news. It's now about, okay, what are we going to do to really engage these musicians? Since we know that they are competitive, we also know that they're interested. So, and we also know on top of that, there's 103 orchestras who are generally thinking they want to be a part of it. So how do we come together and really push this change forward and generate different mechanisms and results which are going to ensure that this change is lasting, notable, and really significant. So kind of with that overview in mind, I would like to now pause and invite Tito Munoz in our midst here to join me here on screen and maybe talk a little bit about the importance of not only NAAS and its existence, but also the importance of the most recent effort, which is the guidelines for the new audition and promotion, which is spelling out essentially ways in which orchestras can implement change toward a more representative musician body.
Thank you, Afa. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you and to speak to you. It's so wonderful to see so many people in the chat observing this talk. NAAS has been a really, it's been, as Afa has mentioned, it's such an unprecedented project. It's bringing together like-minded folks who really are thinking about what the orchestra can be in the future and how diversity, equity, and inclusion is such a huge part of that. What are the barriers that people are facing to get into orchestras? Maybe dispelling some of the myths that we are all believing as far as our audition and tenure guidelines. It's a really, really important aspect, an important resource to provide folks opportunities to be able to have a say and have a seat at the table. And actually have these really, really difficult discussions, these discussions that are ongoing, they're always fluctuating, they're always evolving. We're always learning new things about ourselves, about our own biases, about our own thinking about how things should be done. And it's really, really important that we can come together in a very respectful, very collegial, and very professional way, mix all of our experiences together. Coming to the table with a lot of goodwill. And that's been a really, really important thing, I think, for all of us, is really making sure that this is really coming from a place of goodwill and coming from a place of wanting to really see everything improve, wanting to make our industry better, more inclusive, more welcoming, while at the same time making a very keeping an importance of artistry. And I see Joe mentioning my spiral band scores behind me. Thank you for that. I wanted to also speak about the experience that we had in creating these guidelines. Each one of us on this committee comes from, as Afa said, a different walk of life, a different aspect of this industry. Myself being a conductor, being a gatekeeper, so to speak, a big part of the audition process, but also all the folks who are part of this, who are thinking about this, who are in the contract negotiations, who are hearing what the musicians are thinking about these things. It was so important that we had such a diverse pool of people with a lot of experience to come together and think about what these guidelines could, should be, and how they can really, really start a conversation. And that's really what the document's purpose is to get a lot of us together agreeing on some language to begin a conversation so that we can actually start implementing change in a really, really positive and meaningful way. So with that, I just wanted to give you a brief context. I wanted to invite John and Meredith since they will be the ones taking you through this document, and I'll leave it to both of you to tell us about it and walk us through the document. Thank you all.
Thank you, Tito, so much. And Meredith and I are going to sort of tag team through this, through the guidelines. And I wanted to say that it was a great honor to co-chair this with Meredith. I think that there is, we at NAAS are working hard to prepare people and to give them what they need to be excellent members of your orchestras and ensembles. However, if we can't come to an agreement on to how the audition and tenure process works, then some of us feel that our work is not complete. So we're going to tag team with this. I think, Meredith, you're going to come on, going to turn your camera on there she is. Okay, excellent. So now just to start off with, to go past the preamble, which we hope that you all have had a chance to read, there are some elemental principles that this great committee put together in terms of some thinking about it. And I think the first and foremost one that we all talked about is that it's really important to get everybody on the same page. And that's the number one in this list. Is it's very important to have everybody sort of understand not only the ethos of the orchestra ensemble, but also what the community is like, and to have some really substantive discussions and action items coming out of those discussions about how one orchestra or ensemble might actually be reflective of their community. So that's number one. Number two, and we also felt that the anti-racism, implicit bias, group communication skills were essential. And obviously it's great for the whole orchestra, but in particular for the audition committees and for the tenure committees to understand how bias plays into one's decision making. And I know that there are, of course, programs by the League to help sort of create or to provide funding for that. So all of us on the committee felt it was extremely important that be included in your in sort of the skill building system. So Meredith, I'll hand you over to number three.
Okay, thanks, John. Hello, everyone. And I just want to echo John's words. What a wonderful experience it was working with this group. Very collaborative and really articulate people. And I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to do this. So on number three, setting time-bound benchmarks, we all know nothing gets done unless it's marked in your calendar. So I think that we have this opportunity right now to really have a free and open discussion with no pressure in terms of only a few brave orchestras have stepped out into the front and said, we are having auditions in the fall. So I think the majority of us have an opportunity to really get everyone around the table. Yes, they have to be negotiated. It is a subject of mandatory bargaining, but many of these suggestions are not necessarily, in the document of your CBA. And I think the most important thing is that we be able to have all the involved parties have an opportunity to discuss freely what it is that they think is going to work for your orchestra, because obviously not everyone is going to work for everybody. The number one, obviously, is self-explanatory, not simple to implement, depending on the size of your orchestra and how much time you have to do the auditions. There are possibilities of doing taped rounds, although I don't know that people are excited about the idea of going back to that, but it is a possibility. And I think those are the things that you have to discuss with your, negotiating committee, your orchestra committee, your audition committee. I think that a huge change in what we have done in the past decades is recruiting players of color to come to the auditions. I think we've had a very slim turnout of people to choose from. And so if you have 25% people of color behind the screen, that's going to make an enormous difference in who we end up hiring. Fully screened auditions. I know ICSOM has had a meeting with our delegates and some of our other committee people, and there are some orchestras who have already implemented fully screened rounds. There are some orchestras that are insistent that they won't do it. So, again, it isn't for everybody, but you need to discuss it and talk about it amongst your people. I think, automatic advancement, again, is just something that if you are inviting people, as many of us do, to come to a semifinal round, perfectly simple to ask people of color to invite people, through NAAS that could come and play in that round. Not a big deal. The no hire auditions, again, it's difficult for different orchestras. It just depends on where you are. I think it is expensive. It's frustrating to come to the end of a day or 2 days and have not chosen somebody to come be in the orchestra. And so I would certainly encourage discussion of the idea of saying, yes, whenever this process is over, we are going to choose somebody and welcome that person into our orchestra. Again, the trial weeks, I know my orchestra, I think, is pretty determined to stay with trial weeks, just because there are many little elements of ensemble that that you can judge that you can't judge in an audition situation. But many of those elements you can find out in the tenure process. So it really isn't necessary to have a trial week. But again, you have to decide on your own. So I'm going to pass it back to John.
And I'll just unmute myself. So the number 7 is one that we actually had a significant amount of discussion about, and that has to do with looking at the complete musician. Everybody, I think, agreed on the committee that the few minutes and the prelims that one has to show what one has is not adequate when trying to think about the entire musician and what their abilities might be. So we talked about a lot about how to initiate some kind of interview part to, at some point during the audition, whether that's at the sort of in the finals as part of it, and how to do this in a an anonymous manner. There are ways to actually have a third party might be able to be involved with this, but I think it's really to want to encapsulate what the committee was saying is that really musicians have so much to offer. And I'll just on a personal note at New World Symphony, we really encourage our fellows to get out there and to be able to talk and to be able to communicate with audiences, to be able to do any number of things, whether it's social media or media in general. So just something to think about going forward. Now I'm going to go on to the tenure guidelines. So a lot of discussion talked about how, and just as an overview, in some orchestras, not all orchestras, but some orchestras, kind of the sort of hard to sort of fathom what's going on with actual tenure and how these decisions were made, and how they're communicated sometimes can be somewhat abrupt and not helpful. So we realize that for any musician, but especially a Black and Brown musician, a process of shared feedback throughout the tenure review is important for the sake of transparency. And so there is obviously various things in various contracts about touch points during it, but we sort of recommend more often than not, especially with a new player. Number 2 talks about having somebody who we schedule with the tenure candidates right at the beginning, and representative from management and from the musician committees to go through the tenure process and explain the rights of the candidate, so that right from the beginning it's clear what the process is going to be and what rights do they have. Number 3. Again, a lot of discussion about for a musician coming into an orchestra, it can be somewhat bewildering and overwhelming. So what we were suggesting is that there should be somebody that a senior, not a senior member, but a tenured member of an orchestra and ensemble to be paired with that person to act as their advocate or their ombudsman who can answer questions, so that they help them understand, every orchestra has a culture, and I think it's very important for, obviously, the committee felt it's very important to have that musician understand what that culture is and be able to be within the culture and be creative in the culture. And the last item is the relation of the candidate, the musician committee, orchestra should be collegial and respectful. So this led, and how you accomplish that, I think, is going to be up to each orchestra and ensemble, but definitely transparency in comments, sharing all comments that are made during tenure, review meetings with the candidate, or sitting down with the candidate at every possibility. So with that, I think I'm going to hand it.
John, I think I would just add that
please.
Any of your musicians who is already tenured and is for some reason put in a probationary position already has these rights spelled out in your contract. So in essence, it's just extending the courtesy to somebody new, and you can probably just rip off that part of your contract and put it in the new part. And I do want to backtrack just a little bit to talk about number 7, in adding the interview process. I think part of what makes this one controversial and very difficult is that the actual job description of what your musicians do has tendrils throughout the contract. And if you're starting to change, what it is that you're actually expected to do as a musician, then it gets into other areas of the contract. But again, I think at this point, many of the public speaking engagements and things like that I do with my orchestra is voluntary. And so, you could still say, yes, do this part of the audition process, but anything that you ask a musician to do is going to be, I'm not saying it's not paid. I'm just saying that it's a voluntary situation. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you. Thank you, Meredith. I appreciate those additional comments.
Thank you, Meredith and John, for that excellent summary and kind of revisiting the guidelines. I know many of you have had the opportunity already to take a look at the copy. I know that some of what we'll be discussing is the particulars surrounding it. But I also thought I would yield the podium, so to speak, to Maestro Michael Morgan, who has been involved with this effort as well, just to kind of share another perspective of how he found the process to be and his outlook on the importance of developing these new guidelines. Maestro Morgan?
Once I figured out how to reintroduce myself. It's wonderful to see everyone here, and I, as the last speaker, am probably not going to say anything you haven't heard before, but I will do it briefly anyway. We have a long tradition, for most of us it's a distant past tradition, of not being a very welcoming industry. And for most people, they say this has changed a long time ago, but it takes a long time to live down that reputation. And so I think part of what this whole effort is about is our industry being more obviously openly welcoming, and at the same time welcoming and maintaining its excellence. All of these points were very much discussed very thoroughly and thought through by what was a really excellent team on this committee. And as was said before, we know this will not fit with everyone's current CBA, but we have this opportunity now to think about and try new things. That is one of the silver linings, if you can find them, of the COVID period. We're, of course, looking for an equity of opportunity, and not necessarily an equity of outcomes, but an equity of opportunity. And I know I am largely preaching to the choir here as I look at the names I see coming down. I know you're a lot of people who absolutely believe in all of this now and are looking for ways to do this. And I'm just going to say just a couple of things to end my little contribution about diversity. I think it's worth each orchestra discussing and defining what diversity means for that orchestra, because it is so different from place to place. Depending who's around you and where you live, diversity does not mean the same thing. I'm in a very diverse urban center, Oakland, California, and so it's going to be very different from other places in the country. But the whole country is getting more and more diverse, so it just becomes more and more urgent that we define this word that we keep throwing around. And to make sure that diversity writ large, that is across programming and personnel and guest artists and staff and board and audience, diversity is no longer an interesting luxury or something we could sort of think about. It has become an existential threat to our industry. That is to say, our cities and our people are going to start to drift away from us if they cannot see anything of themselves reflected in our concerts. And as I say, I'm not preaching to the choir, so I see a lot of people who have been great champions of this in the list of people who are here today. But I think it's a wonderful document and a wonderful place to start. And I hope that all of you are able to incorporate as much of this into how you audition and tenure players as you possibly can. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Afa, because I think we're going to get questions now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maestro Morgan, and thank you everyone, John and Meredith, and all the folks who have been contributing to setting up this dialogue. I am excited to get to the questions. We have a good number of them, which I'm going to try to field to various members of the NAAS family, because I can't be expected to answer all of them. I should also acknowledge, while you have not yet seen them on screen, here with us are Bill Neary, who is the project manager for NAAS and does all of the on-the-ground work directly, including managing relationships with all of the member orchestras, as well as managing the well-being and access to resources of all the musicians. So his is the most kind of hands-on comprehensive job of making all of this work. Also with us, although not yet on screen, is Andre Dow, who is our Chief of Artist Engagement at Sphinx, and amongst many other programs, also oversees this entire area. So I just want folks to know and be able to place Andre and Bill into the structure of NAAS, because they're so really critical to everything from conception to actually to carrying this work out. So here we have a good number of questions, and to be fair, I'm just going to scroll up and go in the order that they appear on my screen. If the order doesn't coincide with yours, please don't judge me too harshly. The first question is from Ed Yim. Hi, Ed. Ed tells us the pipeline argument, i.e. would have been more diverse if there were more stronger candidates, is not any longer acceptable. There are talented and qualified BIPOC musicians. Yes, I agree. So what is the program doing to dismantle these perceptions? I think I'd love to throw this one to Bill directly. Bill, as the person on the ground working directly with the artists, but also from a 30,000 view, I wonder what you might say we're doing at NAAS to dismantle the perceptions.
Yeah, thanks, Alpha, and thank you, Ed, for that question. Some of the work that we're doing right now with our 103 NAAS orchestra partners is really sitting down and having conversations with all of them. A really great point that Maestro Morgan just brought up was in regards to the concept of diversity and how it changes throughout the country and throughout different orchestras and even within cities, and really trying to align that definition with the mission of a particular institution. And so we've been having conversations with dozens of our partners on how can we best implement these practices, contracts in your culture within your orchestra. I'm proud to share that everyone that we've spoken to is really taking critical and positive steps forward to make this happen. So the barriers and they vary quite a lot. But it starts and ends ultimately with conversation within the orchestra, with their constituents, with board members, and it's really great to involve us through the process. But ultimately, the task falls on the various committees and task forces created within an orchestra.
Awesome, and kind of also in support of what Bill is saying, one of the practical ways in which NAAS is trying to dismantle these unfortunate misconceptions is that we've developed a national database, which is a searchable instrument that's available directly on the NAAS webpage, which allows orchestras to have a tool at their fingertips and be able to have access to some of the most qualified musicians of color around the country. Andre, did you want to add anything on this front before we move on?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking and checking on that. First, hello, everyone. If you haven't had an opportunity, you can click on the document. It's in the last paragraph. You'll see Audition and Tenure Guidelines in bold. So you can click it there and follow along if you'd like. And thanks, Ed, for your question. What are the barriers and what is the program doing to dismantle them? There's a lot of things that we're doing from the musician-facing side in terms of providing support. And that was one of the main things that we did at the beginning of this initiative. And most recently, we've shifted a little bit more to the orchestra-facing side of things as well. So this document, for example, came out of those conversations from our Artist Council. Some of the members are actually here with us in this chat as well. But one of the things in the conversations that we've had with several orchestras is looking at the Audition and Tenure Guidelines is trying to incorporate them in your CBAs. And so those are some things that I would encourage us all to look at. But the main thing I want to draw our attention to is the very first, the principles that are listed in the Audition and Tenure Guidelines that are things that could be put into place that don't necessarily have to be in CBAs. And that's really having a shared understanding between all of your constituents about what diversity is. And thanks, Michael Morgan, for bringing it up in terms of the diversity conversation. But I think that from the orchestra facing side, having that continuity across everyone's program areas and staff and musicians, and even talking about what vendors you're using, I think those are conversations that we have to have. And those small conversations and those larger conversations are things that we're trying to incorporate to dismantle some of these stereotypes and break down walls. So I encourage everyone to look at those principles and really start from those principles before trying to get into the weeds of every single bullet point that we have listed. Those bullet points are really more for a launching conversation for every individual orchestra. As you know, everyone will not be able to implement them exactly as we have, but it should be a launching point for conversation so that you can take that back to your team and see what that means. But it really all starts with defining what the principles are with the organization.
Great. Thank you for that, Andre. Some of the questions I'll skip ahead. There's somebody asking whether a document is available. It's now being reshared again, although it is identical to what was shared in the past. And if someone still needs access, I think just put it in the chat and we'll send it another way. There's a question from Darren Hicks about how does an orchestra or an organization become a partner to NAAS and join this effort? The short answer is you reach out to Bill directly, and you can do so directly from the website, and Bill can share with you what are the kind of prerequisites, if anything, in terms of orchestras joining, and what are some of the ways in which we ask our partnering organizations to participate. So that could be an easy one. There's a question from Meg. How many of the NAAS musicians are now full-time members of those orchestras versus fellows? I could do this one quickly. About 50%. So just slightly more than 22, 23 musicians are full-time members of orchestras. The rest of them have either fellowship positions or one-year positions. So it's kind of an even split between that larger number that I mentioned. There's a question, there are two questions in one from Alistair. Will there be a recording of this so we can share it with our orchestras? I believe the answer is yes, but Leanne can tell me if I'm wrong. And the second one is, how do we address colleagues? Oops, it went away. Darn, I didn't know what happened. How do we address colleagues, often those in positions of influence and often vocal, who staunchly deny the existence of implicit bias? That's a good one. I definitely have an opinion about it, but I shouldn't be the one to necessarily handle it. I would... Andre, might you like to take this one? Folks who say there's no implicit bias. Suggestions?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I see John popped up, so he may want to add in as well. I would say it kind of goes back to my initial statement. First of all, is having just a shared understanding across the board about what it is that we're hoping to accomplish. I think most people here, maybe not all, but most people here I think we can agree that implicit bias is something that is within us and is inherent, and everyone does have biases. So bringing that to the forefront, I think a lot of the conversations that we have to do with differentiating between what biases are and what diversity is, and we're trying to break down, implicit biases. But that also happens to include diversity. And so I think kind of shifting the mindset of trying to just understand what biases are and not make it about Black or Latinx or white, I think that's a good, might be an entry point into conversation for those who do kind of really strongly disagree that there's no biases that are happening across the board. But it's a very difficult conversation to have. So I would just say, just taking those baby steps and having an understanding of the definitions. So I'll turn it over to John, because I know he's looking to chime in.
Yeah, I think that while there are a number of ways, if somebody who says they don't believe in the existence of implicit bias, there are certain online ways to actually prove to that individual that, in fact, Yes, we all have biases. And one of them that comes to mind is the Harvard IAT tests. I don't have if you just put in Harvard IAT tests and they cover all sorts of things. It's not only in terms of race, but also in physical appearance and all these sort of various bits and pieces as well. So they're very revealing. They're very revealing. And even as somebody who believes that they're not overly biased and they take that, it's quite interesting. And also you can actually, through some of these tests, and definitely the Harvard one, you can chart your progress as well. So you can take the test multiple times. You have to be honest about how many times you've taken it before. And as you do work in racial bias training, etc., then it's interesting to actually even be able to see where you have progressed.
Wonderful. Go ahead.
I'm just gonna, there are some minds that we're never going to change, and it isn't necessarily worth the effort to try. I have to say that when I had my exam call with my delegates and a bunch of musicians, I was really encouraged and surprised by orchestras that were just jumping ahead and talking about this. And I think that this past pandemic year and everything that happened in it has really opened eyes and changed minds. And I mean, mine too, there were a couple of people, I think, that some of the fear surrounding this issue is that musicians who you already have are afraid of losing their own jobs. They're afraid of being cut out from some of the things that they do. And, will you hire people of color that are going to take over my position? And so that too is something that needs to be addressed in these discussions, and to just make sure that everybody is on board and a full member of this discussion.
That's great, Meredith. I think there's a grouping of questions which can be summarized, and I'll try to do so that we can kind of address it. They're all under the rubric or the umbrella of cultures, clashing cultures, of kind of bringing these guidelines. And really, the questions here are speaking to the juxtaposition of an orchestral culture to members of communities which have been routinely excluded. And what's kind of the point of imposing a culture upon people almost from the pretext of having excluded them for a long time? I'll kind of get it going, and I'd love to ask some of my colleagues to join me in that. I should say and clarify that the primary goal of NAAS isn't to impose a culture. The primary goal of NAAS, if I had to summarize it very roughly, is to minimize the unnecessary man-made barrier between musicians of color and existing orchestral cultures, and through a variety of efforts, bring, so to speak, everyone closer together so that we may build what is a set of collectives, which will be the musical collectives of tomorrow, because we do collectively believe that orchestras of tomorrow will differ from what we're used to. And when I say they will differ, they will hopefully be more evolved, more empathetic, more inclusive, and more representative. So the idea there isn't to label one culture wrong and another culture new or somehow better. We are asserting several truths. We're saying that there are, in fact, ready, poised, and qualified BIPOC musicians who we're trying to nurture and empower. We're also saying that there are a number of orchestras who would like to do this work and, in fact, evolve with us. So the role of NAAS is to bring that closer together and really generate change and propel it forward so that we go really beyond these statements and conversations. It does require change. We're trying to make that change a little bit more seamless and, in fact, maybe urgent. But really, that's kind of, rather than really labeling something or judging something, we're trying to provide a set of tools which will make this change a little easier on everybody. There's a question here that's, and I guess I should see, would anyone from the NAAS side like to add to that relative to kind of the culture change and the shifts that are occurring?
If I may, actually, thanks. Sure. I'm seeing a lot of questions about this, and I think coming from people from different walks of life and different experiences. Some folks who are extremely strong advocates of dismantling white supremacy and wanting to really make some very, very substantive change, as right away, because it's a very dire situation for many of us, and running the gamut. One thing that I think is really, really important is two things, actually. This document that we put together, as many have already stated, is a jumping off point. It's okay. Here's one aspect of our industry. It's just one. It's a big one, but it's one aspect of our industry, the audition and tenure process. And what are some of the issues with that? And so what are some of the myths that we can try to dispel? What are some of the things that we can, begin a conversation with? Ultimately, though, none of it really matters unless you in your organization decide what anti-racism is for you and how important that is to the values of your organization. And so that's a big, all-encompassing question. That's something that is much deeper than just, changing a little bit of language in your CBA to change something. That's something that really, those are the existential questions you have to have within. So that's something that I think it needs to be a given with a lot of this, is that, why is diversity important for your organization? What are you doing in your activities that really makes diversity very important? Are you reaching the people in your community that you want to reach, and why aren't you? These are some of the things that I think one needs to be cognizant about. But for the questions from folks that are saying, well, what can I do? How can I move the conversation forward? Because that's also a really difficult thing to do, because even at the top, sometimes it's very difficult to make changes because there's such a huge structure. Orchestras are huge organizations. There's a lot of implications, a lot of tradition. And so you're constantly fighting between two extremes. One is kind of the status quo, and the other one is burn it all to the ground, and so you're constantly having to figure out what it is that makes sense. Is the system that we're in, is there value in what we already have? And is there value in what we have? And then what can we do? And what does change within that mean? How fast or slow is it? What kind of conversations are you going to have with the different constituents? One thing for me that's been really, really heartening, as Meredith just pointed out, is that some of the conversations that I've been having with my colleagues, with musicians, with my musicians in Phoenix, with musicians all over the country, is that people are really hip to change. They're really thinking about this much, much more than I thought, much, much more than a lot of us, I think, may have assumed. And I think this isolation that we've been in for the past year has forced a lot of organizations to have really, really strong internal conversations that they probably never would have had before. Get people getting together in roundtables, talking about things they've never talked about before. And that's been amazing, because all of a sudden the typical conversations that you would normally have when you're talking about labor disputes, or you're talking about whatever, committee versus management, all these sort of typical dynamics that we know of in orchestras eroded for a little bit. They eroded to a point where you could actually come to a table fresh with goodwill and really ask questions of each other. And I think it's imperative that we take advantage of that. It's imperative that we use those opportunities to start really fostering this new idea of how do we communicate with each other internally. How do we have these conversations about what our organization truly means to our community? Is it that we're trying to be the next, huge level orchestra that we're trying to mimic? Or are we actually just wanting to be who we are and figure out what we need to be for our community? I know this is all top level stuff, but I really think that that's the crux of what a lot of these questions are going to come from, because you can literally take that document and say, we can't do that. We can't do that. There's no proof that this works. We've never done this. Sure. I mean, you could take any aspect of it and say that, but in the end, it's not going to matter unless your organization has kind of discussed some of these and answered some of these questions internally about what anti-racism, diversity means for your organization.
Absolutely. Master Morgan, did you want to add something to this one?
I wanted to second what Tito just said, all of it, but I also thought that in terms of changing an orchestra's culture, in fact, changing even an orchestra's programming and changing even the guest artists, I think everyone should just look at everything with the gentle question, why? Why have we done it this way? Is there a reason? Are we just doing it this way because we've always done it this way? And I think that will already change a lot of things, because a lot of the times we're so fascinated by the things we have been doing that we've never stopped to even think about why we do them. We've just always done them. And so assume that nothing is sacred and decide why. You don't have to tear it all down. It's just reconsider everything.
That's absolutely true. Some of the next set of questions, one combining, I think, they're basically inquiring about the progress of how this document is being implemented, and in any examples of practical implementation and how it's already gone through committees. I should say that rather than going through a laundry list of orchestras with whom we're in active dialogue about implementation, I'll say that there are at least 20 known orchestras to us of all sizes in terms of annual operating budget who are working actively to implement all or most of these guidelines. I can't point to one and say that they've been followed quite literally, and these have been the effects, because A, I think we're not at that stage, and B, we're of course not back on stage. So a lot of what's being implemented and piloted and experimented with right now is still at an early stage, but our work and our goal is really to front load a lot of this now, so that when we are back on stage with audiences and when we are all actively auditioning, everyone in fact feels poised and ready with some of these new practices to be able to really aid in that process. I know that from NAAS's standpoint, we stand ready with the musicians because we've been investing in the musicians and their preparation. We now want to extend a hand to all of our partner orchestras and say, we would love for you to use this as a jumping off point, but ultimately, if an orchestra wishes to experiment with different methodology and take nothing from these guidelines, but still yield excellent results, I say power to you. That's terrific. If there are other ways in which you're doing it, then please share it with us. Let us know what doesn't work and why it doesn't work, so that maybe we can all collectively learn to really see some real change here. I see Meredith back here. Meredith.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that although the issue has been with us forever, the document is only a few months in the public eye. And because we're not auditioning right now, I would say it's going to be a full year before we actually know what people are going to implement and see some results. I think Cleveland Orchestra and one other are the only orchestras that actually have a scheduled audition in October or something. So it's going to take some time.
Absolutely. In the meantime, those of you representing orchestras know that you will have upcoming openings. So and we understand and know that too, but connecting those dots and saying, we'll have 6 openings, certainly at the very least. I ought to really go to NAAS and see that we're as prepared as we can be in terms of diversifying the actual applicant pool. How do we make sure that our actual pool and our engagement and recruitment on that front end is as abundant and as thorough as it can be? And that's a place where NAAS can help, even though we're not yet an audition point. So I just want to continue to reinforce that piece. There are a number of questions which go to the particularities surrounding the in-person interview piece, which might be number 7 in our document, but it's the piece surrounding assessing other areas of a musician's fitness to join an orchestra, which doesn't just it doesn't get encapsulated in playing a movement of a concerto or a set of excerpts. So it's the interview piece. How does that live together with the anonymity of the audition process, and what suggestions we have surrounding that? John and Meredith are on screen to save me.
Okay, a couple of thoughts. Obviously, everybody has to come up with their own system. One thought that came forward, which separates out the audition committee assessing the playing from the interview group. And in fact, even thinking about having an outside party not within the symphony family or the ensemble family, do that assessment piece. And in fact, this is done actually very often by headhunters who are basically putting together profiles of the candidates for a job. This is not done by the group that actually does the interviewing for the hiring, but it is done as a separate piece. So that's one way, and then all information in terms of everybody will have obviously a number in terms of the playing audition, and then that file will get associated with that particular number. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is, well, anyhow, I'll just stop there because I think Meredith has some thoughts as well too.
I guess my first thought is, yes, these being a fully blind audition and then having a decision made about extracurricular activities having to do with playing are in contradiction with one another. There's no question. And so you obviously can't fulfill both of those entirely. And I think it was Barbara Bogatin that suggested in the chat that you might have a situation where you have a final round and perhaps 3 players are all approved for hiring. They're all good. And so let's see maybe what else they have to offer. That is definitely a subject of mandatory bargaining, no question, because you are taking power away from the decision-making of the musicians, which is, in the contract, and we have to respect that. But I think that, again, each orchestra is going to have to decide that on their own. Is this appropriate for us or not? Another issue that comes up for me as a union player is that you might think about investing in your own tenured musicians in terms of speaking publicly. And I might mention that a few CEOs could take a lesson in how to speak publicly. But, they're all skills that we all should be developing. And I think that this is an add-on. Is it appropriate to you or not? Is ultimately the question.
Absolutely. I want to do a quick statement of apology because I have identified a number of friends here in the chat by name, but I should have kept all of this anonymous, so I apologize for that. Moving forward, I won't identify folks posing questions regardless of my knowledge or lack of knowledge of them, so definitely sorry for that oversight. There's a question here which is essentially seeking advice for those employed by an orchestra that unconsciously perpetuate a culture of white supremacy, but have started doing DEI work. Essentially, what advice do we give when there are people who are not people of color who are employed by an orchestra, but the DEI work that's being assigned to them or that they're volunteering to do seems to be positioned to make themselves feel better. But in fact, their own actions, in fact, perpetuate the root of the problem. What kinds of things can we recommend to the one questioning here? I'm wondering who I might call upon for that. Meredith, could I ask you to come back?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
No worries, I'll try to do better. What advice do we have for those employed by an orchestra that unconsciously perpetuate a culture of white supremacy but have started doing DEI work when it fails to address the root of the problem, when meetings feel like a way to make mostly white people feel good about doing something that it feels frustrating? What kinds of things might we recommend?
I think the way to address that is to do actual bias training. I think that people in meetings who have not had their minds opened or had any sort of formal training in how to look at yourself, yes, you're not going to get a different result with the same equation.
And I think actually, there's this whole thing and negotiations called the elephant in the corner, and that can be kind of an elephant in the corner, but you really have to, it takes a lot of courage, but to just address it head on. I just said, this is, the work that you're doing, I understand that maybe it's a positive thing. However, I feel, or in my opinion, or, this I think is only going maybe not even part of the way. There's a number of ways, but to actually be courageous and just hit it right on the head.
Yeah, I'll first say that it's an unfortunate position for a member of an orchestra to feel that way, that that they're not currently able to address it. And so I just want to start by saying that I'm sorry for anyone who has to experience that. And unfortunately, my response lies, unfortunately, on the musician who is experiencing that. It takes it takes a lot of courage to do that, especially when this is your employer. But I would encourage anyone who is having those difficult conversations to just reach out to anyone on this panel, reach out to Sphinx, reach out to NAAS, and we can do our best to help facilitate those conversations as well. But at the end of the day, the bias has to be addressed. The work that we are doing is so important and so relevant that if we don't have that basic principle, and that's why we have that as the very first principle, is that everyone must be aligned with the goals of the organization. And so it's a very difficult thing to navigate, but reach out and we can do our part at least to help facilitate a conversation or give pointers as how to have that conversation.
Yeah, I do want to reinforce that for conflictive situations like this, while it isn't the primary work of NAAS, we do want to remain a resource and when necessary help mediate a challenging situation and help provide some pointers and resources as to how something like that can be navigated. There aren't a tremendous number of successful examples, but there are also some basic techniques that can be implemented to root this kind of thing out. Tito, did you want to add something on this topic before
just very quickly? It's a question that actually really hits home to me as well, because even as a person, in a leadership role, it's a question I face in my profession as well. In my role rather, that this kind of difficulty can lie for anyone in any position, because we're in a system. We're in a system that is oppressive, and so it's not easy. I think the caveat is that this is definitely not easy. If it was easy, then we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. But also that I realize also every group is in sort of different points in this conversation as well. And it all depends on the culture. It all depends on a lot of things. There are some times when you just hit a brick wall. It happens. It happens. I experience it. All of us experience it. You just hit a brick wall and there's nothing you can do in that moment. For me, what's been really, really, really helpful is remembering that progress sometimes is very, very real and very tangible, and sometimes it might not seem like it's very, very tangible in the moment. I can recall many instances where just just forcing the conversation to happen already was a step forward. Just literally putting yourself out there, and even just acknowledging the elephant in the room and having that conversation with a group of people that have never had this conversation before, who have never been forced to actually tackle it head on. I think of this conversation as sort of the different stages of grief is the same. I think of it in this continuum, that there's always going to be different points where when you're trying to work on either a culture of an organization or you're trying to work on a specific person, and there are different stages of acceptance of what we're talking about here and what that means. And just knowing where you are with those things, trying as best as you can with empathy, trying as best as you can with the, coming to goodwill, because coming to the conversation with goodwill, because everybody's going to have different reactions to this. There's no easy answer to it, but definitely remembering that progress can be small but can be significant, and sometimes it's not always in the things that you see right up front.
Afa, if I could just jump in very quickly and The purposes of this call for us today is to talk about musicians and diversifying the people on stage. But if you don't change the culture of your organization, if your board remains the same and your management remains the same, the orchestra is not going to change. It all has to be diversified.
Absolutely. So NAAS is attempting to address really all levels and facets of this work, but our focus obviously is preparation of musicians and then to offer our orchestras, however, some tools and real skill sets that they can develop on their own, always subject to local flavor, as we all know, because it's going to differ from one community to another. There are a number of questions which I'd like to take the liberty to group, and they deal with actually the merits of or the significance of blind auditions versus the change in culture. So here I'm speaking on behalf of NAAS, not necessarily my own individual endless thoughts about why in the first place we need blind auditions. I will say that my own thinking on this has also evolved based on countless hours and accounts of listening to very well accomplished professional musicians of color who have time and time again explained the importance and the significance and really the emphasis on blind auditions. I think we're essentially attempting to address what we can address as an alliance of various different organizations who have various levels of expertise in these important areas of work that's trying to contribute to diversification. The change of culture within each orchestra falls upon that orchestra. That we can't do. We can assist, we can support and empower, we can be there as a colleague, and we can help give pointers. However, insisting upon blind auditions from the beginning to end. There are a number of folks here who suggest that blind auditions have addressed the issue of bias from the inside and out rather than addressing the bias or diversity at an organizational level. The blind process as it stands today helped in one way, but created the unintended consequence of racial diversity that we're presently facing in orchestras today. The answer is yes, it has, but there's not yet a better way. Right. So since we can't mandate all aspects of changing culture, what we can do is simply modify or limit our biases. And the way we know how to limit our biases is to exclude the stimuli for these biases. And the way to do that is to really anonymize the process and ensure equity across the board, which is why we're insisting on allowing and inviting everybody to audition. And when selection happens, that it be based upon artistic adjudication and fitness of other qualities, but without really inviting these biases, which without a doubt we all have. So it's not that it's a perfect system, but it does appear to be a superior system to anything else, because what we also do know is that orchestras who have practiced that, there's some data that shows us that they've in fact yielded better results with diversity than those orchestras who do lift up the screens. And really don't practice that limitation of bias from the beginning to end. And that's where it's coming from. So it's not to say that this is perfect or superior. It's just that we haven't identified a better way. Because of that, we're offering the argument for blind auditions. And I think it has been a misnomer because we have been referring to a blind audition concept for decades on end. We haven't practiced those. So to say blind auditions don't work is also a not factually rooted statement, because we don't know if they work or they don't. We haven't practiced them in a truly in a truly blind fashion, not in any systemic way. We have more so periodically and episodically. I think some of the ones regarding number 7 have already been addressed. What would the group advise with regard to balance of intention with fully screened auditions with the hope of being able to prioritize diversity with our musician ranks? Is there a period of time where we can prioritize diversity in hiring and then move toward fully blind auditions? That one we haven't had before. I'd love to, Tito, that'd be great.
Well, I wanted to actually, because I think this ties in with what you just said, Afa, about the blind audition. I think a lot of people don't realize that we really have never really had blind auditions, because in the end, we pre-advance people. we do this already. We already pre-advance people. People that in whatever orchestra you've deemed qualified, whatever that means, you send them to the final round. So we have an apparatus right now to do some of this work without having to change anything in the CBA, actually. The way people hire substitutes, I mean, there's very little in CBAs that have anything controlling how you hire subs. There's already a lot that is not covered by a CBA that does not protect from any kind of bias. There's a lot. And most orchestras haven't taken advantage of that. So that's number one. Number two is often orchestras do pull the screen down in some kind of final round, whether it's because you want it in the final round, or because there is somebody mentioned about a ensemble round. And that's going to have to be an existential question for your own kind of idea of what an audition should be. If you should include an ensemble round, if you have a trial week, and what does that mean? Then you have a year or two tenure process where you're going to see that person anyway. So in the end, the idea of truly blind auditions is really, as Alpha mentioned, it's not totally accurate, because we don't really have that right now. And I think that's one of the things that I think we should try to, if we have it right now the way it is, there are things we can do. We could make a commitment and say, we're gonna headhunt for musicians of color and invite them because we can. Just throwing that out there. Just so that's sort of where I think that's coming from. That's what I wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I want to double down on what Tito just said, because I think that really recruiting a large number of people to come take the audition of color is going to make the biggest difference of any of these suggestions. Just, by dint of increasing the number of opportunities, we all want to hire the best person and the best citizen. And the way to, make that happen is to have the largest candidate pool as possible.
Absolutely. Master Morgan?
Yeah, it really is. I'm coming in on both of what they have just said. It is making sure that there are people in the auditions, because I know very few musicians of color who want to be hired because they are musicians of color. They know that they are at a level that they can compete on the level of everyone else. And so, which is why so many of them really are so strenuous about the need for blind auditions. And if you look at the Sphinx Orchestra or the Gateways Festival Orchestra, these are fantastic orchestras, all people of color. So it's not that they're not out there. You just have to make sure that they show up for your audition, and your audition is welcoming enough that they will come to see it, and go out and find them for your audition if you need to, but still put them in the anonymous screened auditions, because that's how everybody wants to be hired.
Absolutely. I'll also kind of back down a little bit there's a bit of a flavor to some of the questions, and I want to address it because it's sort of encapsulated in much of the feedback that was just offered by both of our music directors and also by Meredith. There's some folks who are looking for data that would support our assertion that fully blind auditions are yield success versus the ones with that variance of lifting the screen don't. It's statistically impossible, right? We don't have that since we haven't been practicing fully blind auditions on an anecdotal level. There are orchestras like the Metropolitan Orchestra who in fact do practice that, and it is one of the more diverse orchestras around the country. Beyond an anecdotal feedback, this doesn't exist because we haven't been measuring it. We can't change what you don't measure, right? So part of what Sphinx is insisting on is that we should be measuring. We are asking folks to have 25% of non-white candidates in an audition pool so that we have a larger pool from which to choose. And the way to do that is to in fact invest in our recruitment and engagement practices in a much different way than we have in the past, so that if we implement that new methodology, we actually can conceivably then look at our statistics and say something has or has not worked. But I think overall, I want to note that it all comes from a mindset. Just some few short weeks ago, we did a session for the League as well, and one of our colleagues Alex Lang, a member of the Phoenix Symphony, and also someone who's been instrumental to this process developing from an early on, said that it comes from the mindset. You can find every possible fault with this guidelines document. You can also find every possible obstacle as to why in your particular very, very unique orchestra, this combination and set of these different points will be disastrous and never work. In fact, we can always, critical thinkers can always find every reason in the world why something doesn't work or isn't ideal. But in fact, if our North Star is the same, this is simply one pathway that we're suggesting to get there. If you have a better pathway, fantastic, Godspeed. If there are better things that are not encompassed in this set of guidelines, please share it. But if we're all saying that we're after the same result, it's just a matter of how we're getting there, then I think it might change the very energy with which we're approaching the process. I say to my own team that we're banned from saying change takes time. We know that's implicitly true, but it's also been centuries, so we've had the time. So now it is, in fact, time to try something, or much overdue, really, to try something we haven't tried in the past, since we're expecting ourselves and others to actually show different results. And that's kind of just an overarching thing that I thought was really important. There are some other critical questions here. Are there resources for headhunting POC? Absolutely. The database in particular is housed on the NAAS website. It's a way to headhunt musicians of color, and it's a searchable tool. Another way to do it is to participate in the Orchestral Partnerships Audition, which is an annual affair that specifically connects the best candidates that we know with our orchestral partners and their representatives, who get to essentially participate in a national audition every year and identify those folks that they wish to connect with. The way to do that is to write to Bill, and I know that he'll be very much there to help. So that is that's a primary work of Sphinx, even outside of NAAS. We're there as a sort of the clearinghouse in many ways, the database, the family that can help with the pipeline and really that connection to the musicians themselves, because that's primarily what we do throughout the year. There's a question here, that's a great one. What makes an audition more welcoming to a diverse applicant pool? Subsidized travel, an EOE statement. Might we, perhaps at Andre, can I call you to screen to help with that one?
Yeah, that's a tough question, actually. What one of the things I would say is knowing that the orchestra has practices in place. And one of the things that orchestras are doing is putting our NAAS logo, for example, on their website so that musicians know that these conversations are being had internally with that specific orchestra. We do have to address the travel through NAAS. We're also able to subsidize travel for our musicians specifically. It is a grant that they apply for. It's not something that an orchestra applies for. So, for example, and I do want to go back to the substitute, or not go back, I want to talk about substitute musicians processes as well. We do have a process in place where if you're looking to hire a musician from our NAAS database, which is now in the chat, our musicians are able to apply for funding to get to know your orchestra, your organization, your personnel. And those types of opportunities obviously will lead to them becoming more familiar with your orchestra and maybe wanting to audition in a future process. So those are ways to really attract the more diverse pools, and just knowing what your processes are and being open about how your auditions are being run. Those are things that I think you could put on the website that will help people feel, and not just musicians of color, but to help everyone just to be, with the transparency of what's happening in the process.
Great. Thanks for that, Andre. Meredith?
I think if you extend an invitation for people to attend your audition, that would be enormously welcoming.
Absolutely. And the other piece I should say is that as you are looking to diversify and engage musicians of color, particularly if it's a new process, if you know of musicians and you've already identified the pool and the processes, but it's a matter of how to reach them or how best to reach out to them, that's another spot where NAAS can be helpful. We can make that connection, that introduction, all of the points that were mentioned by Andre. And I think there's an implicit kind of gravitas that comes with identifying yourself as an orchestra, as a partner to NAAS, because a great deal of the members of the roster are aware of NAAS's work and they're the beneficiaries of the granting program. So for them to know that a particular orchestra partners with NAAS does go a long way to also help with that credibility piece. Tito?
Yeah, I just wanted to second that. I think it's, I think being a part of NAAS and having been part of the SOPA auditions, for example, I think that's really, really helpful because I think it gives an opportunity. This year, for example, we were virtual with SOPA, and it was actually a really wonderful way of getting more of the musicians within the orchestra involved in these auditions themselves, because a lot of the substitute hiring, for example, are inviting folks to final rounds, blind rounds. I think when you have more of the musicians involved in this kind of process and this planning, that the kind of grassroots, that's really where a lot of this is going to also be very helpful to have, because in the end, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about in this document, as we said, has to be done through collective bargaining, and collective bargaining is really a two-way street. But there's a lot that the musicians in the orchestra are going to have a lot of say over. There's a lot of things that are going to be, within that. So those musicians who are on this, I mean, it's really, really important that those dialogues start to happen within the ranks of the musicians themselves, because all of that stuff could be brought to the fore. I think that you're going to get a lot of folks who are really wanting to make a lot of this work. Frankly, but if everybody's really thinking about it together, that would be great.
It looks like Alpha here, so.
Yeah. There are two sets of questions which I will combine because they're almost identical. How do we as musicians balance the need to change when it comes to when the change is coming from administration or board? I think that's a really tricky one. From NAAS's standpoint, we encourage and greatly encourage and cajole our colleagues who are in governance and leadership. We don't think this change is possible without the musicians. At the very ethos of NAAS, it is a musician-centric, artist-centric effort. I don't think any orchestra has a prayer for any systemic change if musicians are not the ones leading it. So I want to say, if you're feeling a certain way, then it's an important piece to try and advocate for your own voice there. And when that's a challenge, it's to come to NAAS as well and let us help you amplify or double down your voice on this, because I don't think it's conceivable that this change will feel authentic or be lasting in any way unless the artists are the ones really at the helm making that decision and owning some of these changes. There is a question about whether there are any plans for NAAS type of a program for singers, professional courses with orchestras. Do you know of any other organizations offering similar type of audition support right now? I'm personally not aware. However, the discussion has occurred in our midst several times. It isn't related to NAAS directly, but our professional choral ensemble Excerpt is having many conversations about doing something similar. It's just a matter of identifying, finding resources to replicate something like this that would be applicable for singers. But we all know it's needed. There's also a question about is there a way for orchestras to directly support the NAAS audition assistant grants? Absolutely. That's part of a way in which orchestras partner with us. Through NAAS directly. That's a note to Bill, and he'll be able to share a set of guidelines and share how to do that simply. These contributions, they vary depending upon one's budget size, so we make it as accessible as possible. And Andre's on screen, maybe to help double down on that.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to double down on that and say, becoming a partner, those resources, there are dues. Those funds are going directly to our artists. And I would say those are suggested dues. So if you want to give more, great. And I did see a question in the chat too about Are we doing anything to provide recording equipment? Those are things that musicians can apply for grants. Anything that helps further them in the audition process, whether it's audition recording equipment, travel subsidies, even coachings. For those who really want to get involved, there's also a place on our website for any of your musicians to go and sign up to be a mentor as well for some of those coaching sessions. And I will say, for those of you who did attend SOPA, you probably are aware of this, but everyone who attended our SOPA competition recently had access to recording equipment purchase. And so we wanted to make sure that they had those things as well. So that's how some of the funds are being used from orchestras as well. So thank you for your support.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Andre. There's a question about, has there been discussion about applicability of NAAS's work specifically to Canadian practices? And there's a question that relates to that about having a national round first. And I should say that not with any intentionality. There's not been a focused conversation about implementing national rounds first. Maybe that's something that the committee can explore further. There's also, let's see, I'm trying to think. What outreach has there been to music directors since they ultimately make the choice of whom they hire and grant tenure to? I should say that there's probably slightly bit of a modification to that statement, assertion, in that music directors play a significant role, but I think the significance of that role is modified slightly, again, by local flavor. And not absolutely every orchestra seemingly functions in precisely the same way, but I should say that music directors are at the center of the conversation. There are a number of music directors who have been supportive of the process, and of course, both Tito and Michael have been a part of this dialogue from very early days and have helped guide some of these guidelines, because we do feel that the voices of music directors are central and critical to how this dialogue continues and ultimately to results. And I would say over the years we've made some implicit progress as well. During Sphinx's global convening that we gather every year in Detroit, there are countless conversations dedicated to the voices of music directors, where we look at a variety of different ways in which music directors have either maybe not prioritized diversity and inclusion in the same way, and also, you can look at it a different way, now have a ripe opportunity to step forward and help accelerate this work. Let's see, what else is here? In our remaining couple of minutes, I am trying to see if I can combine things in a way that addresses largely anything that has not been touched upon. As a follow-up to the earlier question, once the conversation has started or continues on a musician level, how are those musicians in governance properly represent BIPOC members when admin and board is not addressing these issues in a timely fashion? That could be a great question. I thought maybe Tito and Meredith?
They must address those issues. There's no exception. Every element, every family in your association has to be working in the same direction and talking together and making decisions together. You can't have just one arm of your organization changing, because it won't change unless they all change.
Yes, I mean, I don't disagree with any of that, Meredith. That's absolutely right, and I do think, though, that I want to put this as democratically as possible. So I think, one of the things about the relationship, as succinctly as possible, the history of labor management relationships is not great, right? We know this. I mean, that's the elephant in the room. This is always like, if things are not going a certain way, then it's somebody else's fault, and we just point fingers at each other. And that's kind of been the way we do business, right? So we have to kind of take that into consideration when any of this kind of like who's responsible for what is part of the conversation. In the end, like many folks on this panel have already said, we all see the eye on the prize. We want to hope that everybody is on the same page. And it means different things for different organizations. Who you reach out to, who do you trust, who can you talk to, who can actually have these conversations. There's no one answer, but definitely there's a lot of factors. There's how much power do certain folks have within the conversations of like negotiations, for example, or who's on your orchestra committee, who's on your contract review committee, who are those folks and what are their goals when they speak to management and board representatives at whatever you're doing. What is your relationship with board members? I think that's a really, really important thing, especially for musicians. What is the relationship of the musicians and the board, the key board members, for folks who do have leadership roles? Because, not every board member is the same. Some board members are much more passive and some are much more active than others. Who are those key board members? Who are the ones that are really leading things in the board? It can go a million different ways, but I think it's just trying to find those avenues where you can create a relationship where people really talk to each other in a very human way. There's also just a lot of things that, can't be said. Legal reasons, there's all sorts of different things that you have to always remember. Sometimes your ED can't talk to you about certain things. It's not the privy. And sometimes it's really, really tricky thing to deal with and to accept in certain situations when you want something to happen. There's a lot of dynamics. For me, it's always trying to go at it with goodwill, trying to go at it with a sense that everyone really does want the best for each other and why. Try to understand, try to also, put yourself out there to make that conversation happen. That's kind of my experience and how I've been, seeing how this is working in certain situations.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Tito. Thank you to the entire panel and the whole NAAS family for spending this last 90 minutes with us. And thank you to all of the orchestras and many friends across the country and beyond joining in this dialogue. Ultimately, I want to close by saying that this is first of probably many conversations. It's a wonderful forum provided to us by the League, but it does not need to be the only forum. NAAS is committed to staying a resource and a connector from orchestras to musicians of color and vice versa. The idea here is to minimize those barriers. The idea there that NAAS has anyway is to provide the resources and specific tools so that we can actually push the change forward. We recognize this change isn't easy, but we all also recognize that, centuries of discriminatory practices have prevented us from having representative and reflective orchestras. So if we all make the decision and say we're now prioritizing this diversification and representation, we also have to be ready for some of this change to be highly uncomfortable, sometimes also not as quick as we wish. But if we all stay focused on it, and if we all constantly and consistently ask the question of how rather than why not to do something, then I'm confident we'll get there. Thank you again for indulging me for the past 90 minutes. I'm also always open entirely on email in any other way. I think most of you know how to reach me. I want to acknowledge the work of Bill Neri and Andre Dell on the ground and all of the colleagues who do this work as part of chairing various committees. I hope to see you again very soon, and thank you again.